Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at how to take Azure Arc and extend it to a MicroK8S cluster running on a VM. Now, if you're not familiar with what Azure Arc is, it's basically a platform that allows you to extend Azure into other kinds of clouds and on-prem. It connects your resources to Azure and gives Azure the ability to apply some management to those resources, such as VMs and Kubernetes clusters. And it also gives you the ability to apply governance to those platforms as well. And on Kubernetes, it also has the ability to apply some Azure resources in a Kubernetes cluster that you might be running. So with MicroK8S, what you can do is set up a Kubernetes cluster in a minimalist fashion. So this is a single node cluster that is useful for things like IoT work or dev work if you want to use it for that as well. So a single node cluster running Kubernetes allows you to do everything that you might be able to do with a full-blown Kubernetes cluster, but in a more scaled down fashion. So if I want to write software and deploy it in containers, I can use MicroK8S to run that as a Kubernetes runtime, but I can also manage that with governance and policy and other things using Azure. So the combination of these technologies gives you a rather robust platform for doing all kinds of cool things that's tightly integrated with Azure, but it also allows you to deploy this at scale across any different kind of infrastructure or clouds that you might want to use for the purpose of running containerized applications, but also managing those with Azure. So the first thing I'm going to do is install MicroK8S on my virtual machine. So this is Ubuntu, but this will work for anything that can support Snapcraft. So Snapcraft is just basically a package management solution that is brokered by Canonical, but it works across a variety of different distributions, including Red Hat-based distros and Ubuntu-based distros. So it gives you kind of some cross-platform package management that's not typically associated with a specific distro like Red Hat or Ubuntu. It works with lots of different things, so it makes installing some of the software that is on Snapcraft really easy to do. So the snap is pretty easy to install. So we're going to get into a sudo environment, basically drop to root using sudo-i, and then you can do snap install MicroK8S. And MicroK8S is just the name of the package, and then you do -classic, and that basically installs it outside of the sandbox that a snap will typically install into. It installs it more like a traditional app in the Linux context. So when you do that, it will install MicroK8S on that, and you download it, installs it, and when that's done, you're pretty much ready to go. There's a few things that we'll need to do though once we have this installed. So after you've installed MicroK8S, you need to enable some of the add-ons that are needed for a MicroK8S cluster to run with Arc. And these are just using a MicroK8S command. So you need ingress is optional, but if you want to do HTTP workloads and then expose those through Kubernetes ingress, you'll need that. It's just using an Nginx extension for that. It's using the Nginx controller rather. And then you need DNS and storage to make this work. So just run that command and it will enable those. And so it's going to enable those. And then once that's done, you will be able to use the particular cluster with Azure Arc. After installing MicroK8S, it's all set up now. The next thing to do would be to set up CoupeCuddle, which is the command line utility for managing a Kubernetes cluster. So we're going to need that. So you can also use snap to install that. It's real easy to do. Just snap install CoupeCuddle Classic, and that's going to download and install that binary. Once it's up and running, that's installed, but we need to connect this to our Kubernetes cluster. So we're gonna have to move some of the kubeconfig around so that CoupeCuddle can find it, and that will give CoupeCuddle access to MicroK8S. So now we're gonna move the kubeconfig from the MicroK8S folder into a folder that CoupeCuddle can find. So how you do that is just go to your home folder, and then from your home folder, you can make a directory called kube. .kube that is, and that's the home folder for Kubernetes, where the command line utilities that Kubernetes uses is going to look for config files and whatnot to connect to Kubernetes clusters. I probably already have this. No, I don't. So I went ahead and created that. So let's go ahead and get into that folder. Then you can run a MicroK8S command that will output the config into a file. So we're just going to run that with MicroK8S config and then the output to the config file there. And that writes a file into this folder right here. And so then I should be able to run a CoupeCuddle command. So kube get pods or get services or whatever. It's probably going to say there isn't anything available, but I didn't get an error. So that's really what I'm looking for right here. So this tells me that CoupeCuddle is successfully connected into the MicroK8S cluster. The next thing we need to install is Helm, which is a package management system for Kubernetes. So we need to install this so that the Azure CLI that we're going to install in a minute can use that to connect Arc to this Kubernetes cluster. So it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to give you these commands in the video description below so you can run these. But this one will install Kubernetes Helm so that you can then use the CLI to install everything that the MicroK8S cluster needs to connect to Arc with. So let's go and run that. And it's pretty straightforward. Now that's installed. Now we're pretty much set up on our Kubernetes front. We have installed Kubernetes with MicroK8S. We've installed the CoupeCuddle command line and we've installed Helm. Now we need to get this thing connected into Azure. And we're going to be using the Azure portal and the Azure CLI. But the first thing we need to do is install the Azure CLI, which is pretty straightforward. So let's install the Azure CLI using the script that's provided from Microsoft. It's basically going to curl it into Bash, and that will just automate the entire install process. And it's basically just going to run a bunch of add commands and then download it. Now, if you have used this for something like Red Hat Linux or other distros, you'll have to run the appropriate command there. They're pretty much the same, but I'm just doing this on a Debian-based Linux, so it's using apt to install the Azure CLI. Now that everything's installed, we can use Azure Arc to connect this Kubernetes cluster up to Azure. So let's get the Azure portal up here. And if you don't already have something in your list here for Arc, you can simply just search for Arc right here and click on Azure Arc. And then you can see that this has quite a bit of offerings for various things that you can do with Azure Arc. You can install SQL servers that are managed by Arc, just Windows and Linux servers. You can use VMware with Arc. You can do Azure Stack HCI, which is basically hardware as a service that is managed by Microsoft. You can also do Kubernetes clusters, which is the one we're interested in. And there's a lot of things that you can even do in this context. And you can see that I already have one right there that I've been using for some other work that I've been working on. But in this subscription, I'm going to go ahead and add another one right here. I'm just going to click add a Kubernetes cluster with Azure Arc. And this is pretty straightforward right here. So click on this and it's going to tell you the prerequisites. So it's going to say, do you have the Azure CLI? Do you have these ports open, etc.? We've already done all that because we've installed the latest version of Kubernetes. We've installed the Azure CLI. We've done a couple of other things. Now this extension right here will get installed whenever we run the command, so we don't have to worry about that just yet. And we've already set up the kube config to use the admin level credentials that we're going to have for our given cluster. So we're in a good shape already running MicroK8S with the commands that we did. So let's go ahead and click on the cluster details. And this is where we can pick the region that the resource will show up in. And so I'm just going to call it Arc Demo 2 or something like that. Let's just click on that. And then I'm going to call my cluster Arc Demo 2. Because I think I already have something called Arc Demo 1. And you can just pick a region that will work for you. So East US, East US 2. Now, this doesn't mean that this is the region that your cluster is going to be running in, because the cluster is off of Azure. That's kind of the point of Azure Arc. You can have this running on-prem. You can have it running in another cloud. This is where the administration of that cluster is going to reside. So basically, Azure Arc is going to reside in this region, and your cluster is going to be somewhere else. And you want it to be rather close to where your region might be for your cluster, so that there's low latency between the two. But this is just where it's going to show up for the management features of Arc. So we're going to do East US 2 because that's pretty close to where this particular VM that I'm running this particular MicroK8S cluster on is located. And then I can pretty much just go past this right here for tags. You can put in data center, city, state, and region or what have you here. And this is good for location and filtering your resources. Especially if you're using Azure Arc and you want to have these available to you, you can set these tags up. And those are good tags to use. For a demo, they're probably not needed. And notice this script right here. This is important because this is useful for just basically copying and pasting commands into the AZ CLI using the command output right here, because this is going to give me the subscription to use. It's going to give me the correlation ID. I've got all this already, and I don't really need to mine this data out. I'm just going to take these commands right here, copy and paste them into the CLI. So the AZ CLI right there, AZ logon, is going to give me a URL. And that URL is one that will allow me to log on to this device. So I'm going to copy and paste that here. And it gives you a code right here. So this is a unique one-time code that you can paste into this guy that correlates this logon with that particular command that I just issued. And then I'm just going to log this in. And yes, this is the Azure CLI. And once that's done, you can close the window. And then you can pull up your instance of AZ CLI. And this should come back in just a second once it figures out that I've authenticated. Now that that's done, I can then paste in some of these other commands right here. So I'm just going to use the count set command right here to paste to get the subscription pointed to the login pointed to the appropriate subscription. If you only have one, it will default to that, but I have multiple, so I'm just going to use that one, which is the one that my Arc is installed in. And then I'm going to select the resource group, and this is basically going to create the resource group right here, and that's going to put it in the appropriate region. Before we run this command here, there's one thing that we need to do to our subscription if we have not already done so, and that is register some providers. So if you've already done this, this is a once and done type thing. You'll never have to do it again for the subscription, but you basically need to install some providers on the subscription, or basically enable them, so that the AZ CLI can actually perform these commands right here. Otherwise, you won't be able to run Azure Arc with a Kubernetes cluster. They're not enabled by default. So to do that, there's a couple of commands to run. And the first one is just basically a registration command that looks like this, AZ provider register, and it's just namespace Kubernetes, and that's going to enable the Kubernetes cluster right there to run. And then there is this one right here, which is the configuration that's going to allow this to configure the Kubernetes cluster. And then there is the extended location, which is needed as a way to extend Arc beyond your particular subscriptions in Azure regions. And so you set the extended location up to basically just identify resources with that location. So you kind of need all of these to make all this stuff work. Now, you don't need the extended location to run the Kubernetes cluster and associate it with Arc. That's really used for some of the extensions that you add onto your Kubernetes cluster, such as database extensions or app service extensions or things like that, that you can use with Azure Arc. So now that I have these already installed, you can basically run that last command, which is already in the Azure portal. So let's go back over here and grab that. Now, if you haven't installed these providers before, it can take a few minutes. So give it about 2 to 10 minutes. And once those are done, then you can run the connect command right here. And so this is basically going to use this extension right here that I have not installed. And it's going to install it, or ask me to install it rather, once I run the command. And then it will then connect my Kubernetes cluster up to Arc. And then it's asking me to install the extension. I'm going to say yes. And you can pre-install these if you want to, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this. And it's basically going to install the extension and then connect this up to Kubernetes, which Kubernetes up to Arc, which can take a few minutes to do depending on the state of Azure, as well as the speed of your connection and the speed of the box. And so it's saying, this is going to take a few minutes. So just sit back and relax and let that finish. And once it's done, you'll get some JSON output, and you'll be connected into Azure with Arc using an on-prem Kubernetes cluster. So after you've run all those commands, then you can click verification, and then you should get a output like this. Arc demo was successfully connected to Azure. Now, if you're in the CLI and you're seeing something like this, sometimes this times out, this operation will, and it might be stuck. That's not something that you did wrong or what have you. Sometimes this can take a while for output. Sometimes you'll get a JSON output. I've had it go both ways. But if you can see the cluster in the portal, then you know that you've connected to it successfully. So if I refresh this, I should see my second one right here. So once your Kubernetes cluster is connected to Arc, you can choose it in the Azure portal. And you can see here that it is now connected to Arc. And you can see that I have a number of different things I can do inside of this Kubernetes cluster from the Azure portal. It gives me some basic monitoring capabilities, and I can also do a lot of things about connecting the logs in my Kubernetes cluster and having them aggregate back up to monitor and issues and other things like that. So I can basically monitor the cluster in its entirety using Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. And it will pull those logs from containers as well as the cluster back up into Azure. Now, the other things that you can do with this is install extensions if you so choose. So the extensions that we'll get into these in future videos, but these are some pretty cool things that you can do with it. So basically it allows you to install API management and app services into your cluster, so you can run things like Azure Functions in your inside of your cluster, or you can even run app services there. The data controller allows you to run things like SQL instances in your cluster. So basically, create a SQL server on your cluster if you want to do that. You have a Key Vault provider. It's not going to put Key Vault on there, but it will allow you to use Key Vault with your cluster. Then, of course, you can deploy machine learning through Azure machine learning, and then of course Event Grid, which is basically a messaging platform. But the two that I'm most excited about for this are this data controller right here, which is basically managed databases running on a Kubernetes cluster that I run on-prem or in another cloud, and the app service extension that's going to allow us to run app services in basically a fully managed environment on hardware and compute that's not on Azure. So this is going to be really cool. Once this has out of preview, this is already in GA, so you can do this. And we'll look at those in a future video. But for now, I just want to deploy a basic workload to this. And you don't have to use those extensions. You can use this Kubernetes cluster just like you would any other standard cluster. And the way you can do that is deploy your Kubernetes manifest files right inside of the Azure portal right here, or you can do it from the CLI as well. And we'll look at how to do that in just a minute. But this is how I can do it basically by going into the portal and using one of these features right here. If I want to do a workload, what I need to do is get a token that allows me to connect to this. So let's look at how to do that, and then we will deploy a workload using the portal. To get the token, there's just a couple of commands that we need to run against our cluster. And the token itself is pretty straightforward. It's basically just a Kubernetes secret after we create a user. So the first thing we need to do is create a user, and you're going to use CoupeCuddle to do that. So you'd use CoupeCuddle create a service account, and I'm going to call it our Arc user. And then we're going to assign that to a role, which is basically a cluster admin role. So that's going to assign that Arc user to a cluster admin role. And then what I can then do is create a secret for that's basically just going to be a token that I can use off of my Kubernetes cluster to allow this user to access the cluster that basically I'm going to use in the Azure portal. So let's go and do that. And that's going to create the secret. And now we can output that token using a couple of commands right here. This is basically just going to output it as base64. And again, these are all linked in the video description below. So I'm going to grab this base64 string right here, and I'm going to take that back into the portal. And paste it back into this box right here and click sign in. It's going to validate the token. It's going to show me all of the containers that I have running on this particular cluster right here. So I have all of these that are kind of part of the core systems right here. And then these are all the Azure Arc containers down here that were installed as part of my connection up into my Arc instance right here. So I have these running right here, but I want to create a workload that is going to be my software. So I want to deploy something that I can use. So to do that, I'm going to use a demo that I've done dozens of times over, but this time I'm going to use Azure Arc, and that's to install Commander Keen using the Azure portal. So to do that deployment, I'm basically just going to click add right here, and this is going to give me a text box to put in some YAML. This is just a Kubernetes manifest. So it's got two different resources on it. It's got a service that it's going to be exposing. That's basically a load balancer. And then behind that, I have a pod that's running as a deployment. So I only have one instance of this, but this is going to be basically taking this pod right here and exposing it as a service on this IP address. Now, this is the external IP address from the perspective of the actual VM that I'm running. So this is a kind of a local IP address that I'm hard coding here. So I want this to show up on that IP address for this virtual machine. However, I do have some port forwarding that I'm going to be using to connect to this. So the port forwarding is basically going to be a public IP address on the public internet that's going to do some reverse NATing to this IP address behind this. But from the perspective of the cluster, this is the external IP address. So I'm going to click create, and this is going to create a deployment and a service. And we can see that show up in the portal once that creates. So I see here my deployment right here is my Commander Keen pod. And if I come back over here to services, we'll be able to see that Keen service creator right here as well. So that is up and running. And then I should be able to see my Keen pod here in just a second as soon as that creates. Okay, now it looks like this is up and running. So if I want to just poke around on it, I can see some of the kinds of things that this is going to give me about this particular pod and this deployment. It's just, here's all the pods that are part of this deployment. And this is just some of the stuff that if you show you how many replicas are available, how many that you want, and so on. There's the selector for the app and so on. If I want to see the services too, you can drill down on each of those and get detailed information about those as well. So you can see that this is exposing an external IP address. It's got some selectors on it and so on for pointing the service to the back end, which is that particular deployment that I just did. So to see if this works, let's go ahead and pop open a new browser window here. And I grabbed the IP address already, and this should pull up a list of files, which is just using VNC in a browser window. And this is just running a DOS box and then streaming the results back through a WebSocket to my browser window here. And this is just an old DOS game that I use in demos because I can run a DOS game on Kubernetes and serve that up through Kubernetes and then run it off the VM. But I deployed this using Azure Arc. So that's kind of a cool thing that you can do with it. And once you deploy it, then your workload is up and running. So this is now running on my virtual machine from my VM that's been orchestrated from the Azure portal using Azure Arc. So this is not the last thing I want to show you, though. I do want to show you one last thing before we go, and that is how to use the Azure CLI to connect to this particular Kubernetes cluster using the Azure CLI to basically configure my local CoupeCuddle to connect to this Kubernetes cluster, which is not something that I have immediate access to. So to do that, I would actually have to SSH into that VM, but I don't want to have to SSH in that VM. I want to do it locally, and I can use the AZ CLI to basically broker that connection so I don't have to have my Kubernetes environment exposed. Rather, I can use the Arc enabler to give me those credentials that I need to connect to it. And once I have those credentials, I can then run CoupeCuddle in the local context and have my Kubernetes cluster running somewhere else on the public internet. So I'm back on my local box here. I'm no longer SSH'd into that VM. And what I want to do now is connect my local context here to that Kubernetes cluster. So basically the way I'm going to do that is proxy it through Arc. So what I can do here is use the AZ CLI to serve as a proxy to that cluster. So that cluster doesn't have to be publicly exposed to the internet for this to work. You just basically run this command right here with the AZ CLI. So you're going to do AZ ConnectedKate's proxy, then you give it the name of your cluster on the Azure portal or from the Azure CLI, wherever you get that from. And that's the Arc cluster, and then the resource group where that resource exists. And what this is going to do is it's going to configure your local context with the permissions it needs to connect to that cluster in the kubeconfig file so that CoupeCuddle can then connect to it. And then it's going to start basically a daemon running on a local port that will allow me to connect CoupeCuddle to this local port. And then from there, it will then forward all the commands from the local port back up through the this channel right here to Azure. Then it will then put those back into my virtual machine that is running my Kubernetes cluster. So you can see that it says it's ready to go on Arc Demo 2 right here. It's updated that kubeconfig file, and then you can close the proxy with Control C. So to connect to that, the next thing I need to do is get a new window. So I'm going to open up a new window, and then I can see that I have CoupeCuddle already installed here on Windows. So CoupeCuddle is just showing you that I have it installed here. Then you run this right here, CoupeCuddle config set context arc to the name of your cluster that is on Arc on Azure. So in this case, Arc Demo 2. So this will set the context to that. So now I should be able to run commands against this. So if I do CoupeCuddle get pods, this should show me that Commander Keen pod that we just set up a moment ago. And this is where it's running. If I do get services, then I should be able to see those services that I was running a moment ago. And there's that Commander Keen service that I created as well. And if I want to see all the stuff from the stuff that is running on Kubernetes that is part of Azure Arc, I could go to get pods and then do the namespace Azure Arc. And that's going to show me all the pods for everything running related to Azure Arc and so on. So this is just a convenient way to get you connected to your Kubernetes clusters by way of Azure Arc. And this is just some of the cool stuff that you can do with it, kind of out of the box. We're going to look at other features of this in future videos when we look at some of the extensions and how those work and some of the cool things that you can do with those as part of using Arc with Kubernetes.